Thank you for the introduction, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to discuss CEDA's 2017 political and economic outlook. I know you will excuse me for looking beyond the year ahead. My purpose today is to emphasise an urgent need for action today, certainly, to build a stronger and better Australia for tomorrow. Acceptance of the urgency of action is long overdue. For some time now, sluggish complacency has been undermining the quality of life available to us, to our children and to our grandchildren. Australia is a great place to live. It's a great place to run a business, and the Australian economy has proven resilient for quite some time. Over the past 25 years, this economy has avoided a technical recession, despite some nasty shocks associated with the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98, the turn of the century tech wreck in the United States and the developed world recession that followed that, and the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, of course. There is much in Australia's past to be celebrated, but none of this gives Australians any confidence in the future. In recent months, the National Australia Bank has surveyed our business customers, and we've also surveyed the broader community about their attitudes to this country of ours, including their vision for the nation's future, sources of opportunity, and the obstacles that they consider need to be overcome. 90% of the Australians we surveyed consider Australia to be a great place to live today, but only half think that it will still be a great place a decade from now. And while 82% of businesses think that Australia is a great place to run a business today, only 60% believe it will remain so in 10 years' time. Remarkably, only 1 in 5 Australians believe that we as a country have a clear shared vision for our future. These findings are compatible with the writings of respectable commentators whom, for some years now, have been drawing attention to deep community disaffection. Disaffection with business, with politics, and with media, both here and, of course, in other parts of the world. And yet, when we ask people in our surveys what a future Australia should look like, their responses were compelling. Moreover, and this is actually the most important conclusion to emerge from our surveys, the visions that were being described by our business leaders and those in the broader community were in substantial harmony. Most Australians, it turns out, want to live in a future Australia that is safe and secure, that is fair, that's inclusive, that's tolerant and free. They want lives that are healthy and affordable. They want lives in which they can continue to enjoy Australia's open spaces and a high-quality natural environment. Most businesses told us that they want to operate in a future Australia that has thriving regions, affordable housing options to support a growing population, in a society that is even more open, even more inclusive, with a stronger commitment in the public sector to pay down debt. This is no fantasy. This is a vision well within our reach. Yet Australia's leaders are not looking. The leadership task is urgent. Moreover, the leadership task is achievable. We must start with a realistic assessment of where we are, considering the challenges and the opportunities before us, and then we must develop a clear roadmap to the future that's being described by our citizens. I'm here today both as a Governor of CEDA, of course, and as Chairman of the National Australia Bank, one of Australia's largest companies and also Australia's biggest business bank. So let me start with the role of business leaders. Business shapes the economy. The commercial decisions of our businesses determine what is produced, for whom it's produced, and at what price it's produced. Our decisions determine who gets a job, how much they're paid, and where they get to live and work. Right now, business investment in Australia is soft. Since 2013, mining investment has declined sharply and non-mining investment has been flat in nominal dollar terms for several years now. Why? Of the businesses we surveyed, 85% said that they wanted to invest more in their businesses and grow, but half of them, fully half of them, identified a lack of a clear plan for the future as a significant factor that's holding them back from making investment decisions. Australian businesses, they will not invest, they will not create jobs unless they have confidence in Australia's economic future and unless they have confidence in Australia's place in the world. According to our research, Australian businesses see our strong rate of population growth as a positive. Well, that's not surprising. And they identify the following as important additional factors in supporting business growth. Firstly, greater certainty in the domestic economy. Secondly, less red tape, less regulation and a simpler taxation system. Third, modern and efficient infrastructure. And fourth, better access to skilled domestic workers. Well, it's up to business to make the case for change, and it's up to business to lead change. In the broader community, there is considerably less support for a larger population. People are concerned about the impact of a growing population on traffic congestion, on urban amenity, on environmental sustainability, and of course on housing affordability. And they worry about our ability to sustain Australian norms of social and economic inclusion with such a rapidly growing population. These concerns too are understandable. Australia's business leaders have to accept responsibility for ensuring that strong population growth and the investment opportunities that go with it lift economic and social opportunity for all, and without damaging the quality of the environment that we pass on to future generations. That means that we, leaders in Australian business, are going to have to take an interest in traffic congestion. We're going to have to take an interest in housing affordability, in urban amenity, and of course in environmental amenity. And that, by the way, includes climate change mitigation and adaptation. If we want better access to skilled domestic workers, then we are going to have to offer those workers the prospect of better lives. If we want modern and efficient infrastructure, then we're going to have to take an interest in the design of our cities. We're going to have to take an interest in regional development, and we're going to have to take an interest in the planning of new urban centres. If we want less red tape and less regulation, then we're going to have to demonstrate that regulation is not necessary. And if we want greater certainty in the domestic economy, then we're going to have to start delivering it ourselves. Topics that we in business have traditionally assumed to be in the domain of public policy and not the stuff of business, these topics are going to have to become our constant preoccupation. We do nobody any favours, least of all our shareholders actually, when we in business boast proudly on the one hand that we are the source of jobs and incomes, but on the other insist that we need accept no responsibility for the impact of our business decisions on communities and on the environment. Future success for Australian business will be built on a foundation of trust. Well, that statement's true of every business, but of course particularly of banking, the industry in which I lead one of the larger players, an industry reliant entirely on the quality of customer relationships, on earning their confidence and their respect. Within National Australia Bank, I can tell you that our leaders do understand our accountabilities to our customers, to our shareholders, and to the communities in which this bank operates. Every day, people inside the bank are seeking to serve our customers better. Our goal is to ensure that the community has greater confidence in our products, has greater confidence in the services we deliver, has greater confidence in our people. We do take pride as a bank in the important role that we play in building a stronger Australia, that we lend more to small business than any other bank, that we're the leading arranger of finance for Australia's major infrastructure projects, that we have the market leading position in the financing of renewable energy, that we contribute to building a more inclusive community by enhancing opportunities available to Indigenous Australians and supporting those affected by domestic violence, that we generate incomes for millions of Australians and close to 35,000 employees. All of Australia's business leaders, including at NAB, could though talk more openly, with greater conviction and more inclusively about the role we see our businesses playing in building a better future for all Australians. But what about politics? Meanwhile, our politicians have dug themselves into deep trenches from which they fire insults designed merely to cause political embarrassment. Populism supplies the munitions, and the whole spectacle, the whole dreadful spectacle, is broadcast live via multimedia 24/7. The country that Australians want cannot even be imagined from these trenches. Today's political dysfunction stands in marked contrast to earlier periods of policy success, where politics was adversarial, where it was every bit as partisan, but when the tribal tensions within parties were generally well managed, and the political contest appeared to energise policy, not kill it. Almost every major infrastructure project announced in every Australian jurisdiction in the past 10 years has been the subject of political wrangling. In the most recent federal election campaign, no project anywhere in the nation, not one, had the shared support of the Coalition Labor and the Greens. Every government proposal of the last 10 years to reform the tax system has failed. And the long-term fiscal, economic growth and environmental challenges identified in 4 intergenerational reports over the past 15 years, the opportunities identified in the White Paper on Australia in the Asian century, simply ignored. The reform narrative of an earlier period has been buried by the language of fear and anger. Language doesn't seek to explain, language rather that seeks to confuse and to frighten. And meanwhile, the platform burns. 4 interrelated policy challenges demand immediate attention, critical to building the Australia that Australians want. All 4 of these predate the present federal parliament. Firstly is the need to repair this budget. Second is the need to plan for a strongly growing but ageing Australian population. Third is the need to settle the policy framework for climate change mitigation and energy security. Fourth is the need to ensure that we as a nation are set to make the most of the Asian century. I obviously don't have time today to do justice to these topics, but I'll make a few remarks. I'm going to start with the federal budget. Australia's current tax system was designed to achieve a reduction in the size of government over time. It was designed to force spending below the average of 24.1% of gross domestic product recorded by the Howard government in its 11.5 years. But that hasn't happened. While payments were at 24.1% of GDP some years after the global financial crisis in 2012-13, the most recent mid-year economic and fiscal outlook reveals that they had risen to 25.6% of GDP by 2015-16. They're projected, according to the MyEPO, to be 25.2% of GDP in every year from 2016-17 out to 2019-2020. According to the most recent budget, payments will then rise further, partly as a consequence of population ageing, which is a topic we've been talking about since 2002. This is bigger government. This is not smaller government. And you know what? Bigger government must be paid for. But how? It's easy to accept that the budget has an expenditure problem. It surely does. But this budget is also relying heavily on fiscal drag to lift revenue by about 3.5 percentage points of GDP. That's more than $60 billion a year in today's money. To lift revenue by that much over the decade to 2019-20. Well, a fiscal strategy with that dependence on fiscal drag also has a revenue problem. And the budget confronts other challenges for which it's ill-equipped. Even with strong growth in the size of government and very strong growth in public debt, We do not have the infrastructure capacity to support today's population, far less the population of the future. How will we fund the biggest infrastructure build in our history? And what about infrastructure planning? A few years ago, I spent some time in Beijing. One of the meetings I had was with an Australian architect working there. When I asked him what attracted him to working in China, he related an anecdote. It went like this. The Chinese government had issued a request for tender to design from bare earth a brand new city for 2 million people. His firm had been successful. Now, where else in the world could you have the opportunity for that sort of work, he asked. Where indeed? On the basis of official projections of Australia's population growth, our governments could be calling tenders for the design of a brand new city for 2 million people every 5 years. Or a brand new city the size of Sydney or Melbourne every decade. Or a brand new city the size of this one, Canberra, every year. Every year. But that's not what they're doing. Instead, they've decided that another 3 million people will be tacked onto Sydney and another 4 million people onto Melbourne over the next 40 years. Already, you know this, both cities stand out in global assessments of housing affordability and traffic congestion. And even if we do manage to stuff an additional 7 million people into those cities, what are we going to do with the other 9 million Australians who will be added to the Australian population in that same period of time? Because over that period of time, Australian population is projected to grow by 16 million people. Have you ever heard an Australian political leader addressing that question, where the other 9 million are going to live? Do you think anybody has a clue? At the very least, we're going to have to find radical new approaches for infrastructure planning, radical new approaches for infrastructure funding, and indeed radical new approaches for construction of infrastructure. And that includes energy infrastructure, which is critical to our economic performance and our quality of life. What can one say about energy? The biggest challenge confronting the energy sector is that climate change policy in Australia is a shambles. At least 14 years ago, our political leaders were told that there was an urgent need to address the crisis in business confidence in the energy and energy-intensive manufacturing sectors due to an absence of credible long-term policies to address carbon abatement. More than 14 years ago. It's quite extraordinary, but nevertheless true, that things are very much worse today. And what about making the most of the opportunities of the Asian century? Well, I never hear our political leaders even talking about this topic today. Addressing the 4 challenges I've identified will require, at the very least, all of the following. First, apolitical infrastructure planning and pricing, including the widespread use of road user charging. Second, a much lower company tax rate or some other mechanism that reduces substantially the cost to Australian businesses of equity capital that they source from offshore, and achieve much more quickly than is presently under consideration by our Parliament. Third, the complete removal of stamp duties on residential property. Fourth, symmetrical tax treatment of interest and capital gains. Fifth, an overhaul of state-based royalties. Sixth, market-based price signals to guide climate change mitigation and long-term investment in the energy sector. Seventh, a broader base and a higher rate of GST. And eighth, a substantial adjustment to the roles and responsibilities of the Commonwealth and the states. And I stress that this is a minimum set of long overdue reforms. Bear in mind also that our present fiscal position means that buying reform through budget-funded compensation in excess of normal indexation, buying reform is not an option. Reforms have to be directed to strengthening, not weakening this budget. Of course, I have no confidence that this list of urgent and essential reforms will be achieved by today's Parliament. Let me conclude. Not so many years ago, an optimistic nation of Australians could be proud of a country that pioneered world's best policy and nurtured world's best institutions. Certainly, I was proud. But nobody nobody any longer looks to Australia to see how it should be done. And yet, there are very few places in the world with our potential, blessed with such an extraordinary set of opportunities. This is a country rich in opportunity, especially because of an unprecedented developments in several Asian economies with which we have strong complementarities. Australians are calling for their leaders in politics, in business and in the broader community to develop a shared commitment to a clear vision for our future. It's about time we delivered.